And we're also practicing inclusive advocacy. We're not saying, hey, you're racist, you need to change. We're saying, hey, we who love ballet, we need to fix this. We need to get together and figure out a solution to this.
Hello, and welcome to Art Restart, where we explore how artists are reinventing their fields and building a new landscape for the arts. I am Piercarlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, a production of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be meeting choreographer, director, and ballet scholar Phil Chan. About 7 years ago, Phil decided to turn a long-standing frustration into a wellspring of activism. Although American entertainment had made great progress in eliminating the use of blackface, the standard ballet repertoire in companies throughout the country was still full of Yellowface, demeaning and wildly inaccurate depictions of Asians and Asian-ness, including in that perennial holiday favorite, the Nutcracker. So Phil teamed up with prima ballerina Georgina Pazcoguin to create an advocacy organization named Final Bow for Yellowface. Final Bow for Yellowface started working with ballet companies in America and Europe to convince them to eliminate offensive depictions of Asians in their repertoires and also help them find inventive and respectful ways to stage culturally important but problematic ballet classics. Their work has paid off, notching up notable successes here and abroad, and changing the culture in ballet companies to value and welcome a broader array of artists, as well as audiences, of course. Phil distilled his ethos and tactics in his book, Final Bow for Yellowface, Dancing Between Intention and Impact. As a director and choreographer, Phil has put his own stamp on once problematic Orientalist standards. Last year, he directed Madama Butterfly at Boston Lyric Opera, in a production that the Boston Globe called an invigorating and meaningful reclamation of Puccini's beloved opera. Earlier this year, he co-choreographed with Doug Fullington the ballet La Bayadère at Indiana University. In their staging, Phil and Doug maintained Marius Petipa's choreography, but they moved the ballet setting from a 19th century India sprung from a European imagination to the homegrown American exoticism of 1920s Hollywood. Just a few days after this interview, Phil announced that Oakland Ballet Company had appointed him artist in residence. I started our conversation by asking Phil to describe what it was like for him to come up as an Asian American dancer when Final Bow for Yellowface was just a glimmer on the horizon.
You know, I just distinctly remember going to see the Nutcracker with my dad. I was pretty young, and after the Chinese dance, he turned to me and said, "Is this really what you want to do? Because this will be all that you are ever seen as." And it was just sort of the thing where like you didn't really see it in the same way until, because everyone's doing it and it can't be wrong if everyone's doing it. And I don't know, as a young dancer, you don't really always have the right vocabulary to talk about it. So I distinctly remember that. But also, graduating from college, moving to New York City, I was 20 and I wanted to be a choreographer. And I looked at the two big ballet companies here in New York City, American Ballet Theatre and New York City Ballet. And ABT, I think, had hired one Asian choreographer since its inception. That artistic director at the time had hired zero during his tenure. And New York City Ballet had yet to hire Ed Liang, who was the first Asian choreographer invited to make work. And that happened, in the last 5-10 years. So just seeing that, oh no, the door is not open for someone like you, that they aren't interested in your ideas, made me put that dream on a sort of a back burner, because that wasn't something that was I felt was open to me.
You were dancing, but you were putting your dreams of becoming a choreographer on the back burner.
Sure. And I think it really came to a head when there was a beautiful production of Sleeping Beauty choreographed by Alexei Romansky, reconstructed from notation. And as a dance history nerd, I was really excited about seeing this production, and it premiered at ABT, I think 2015. And I just remember really enjoying it until the third act, and there was these sort of porcelain prince and princess kind of comes out and sort of bobbing and shuffling in a stereotypical sort of Chinese way. And it just felt like, oh God, do we really need that? Like, when we're restoring the classics, like,
So you mean,
it
so
just,
this production had been reinvented in some other ways, but not that one?
well, no, I mean, he was restoring this original production, which did
Oh,
have
I
this sort of
see.
Chinese porcelain prince and princess, but I just felt like it was like, oh, just because we're going back in time, do we really need to recreate this sort of Oriental caricature? But it really came to a head when the artistic director of New York City Ballet, Peter Martins, called me in 2017. My very good friend Georgina Pazcoguin, who was the first Asian woman to be promoted to soloist at New York City Ballet. She was in a diversity committee meeting, and the topic of the Chinese dance came up, and she slipped Peter Martins my phone number. He wanted to talk to me because I both knew the ballet inside and out, but also had the lived experience of being Chinese, living in the minority here in America, and what the impact of this dance could be. So we talked about the Chinese variation of the Nutcracker, and the history of Asian people being represented, and the history of ballet itself. What cultures were part of the development of this art form, which came from the Italian and French courts, incubated in Russia and found a new home here in America. What cultures contributed to this. So I left that meeting and basically called Gina and said, I think Peter's going to make some subtle changes to the Nutcracker. And it was really in that moment where we realized we had sort of a choice. We could either just quietly go back into the night and say, great job, New York City Ballet. But we were also looking around at the rest of the landscape and saying, wow, so many companies are saying, yes, diversity, equity, inclusion. Yes, we want European folks to come into this art form and feel included. But yeah, like ching chang chong, like here's your culture. Like, sorry, we're not willing to change it because that's tradition and that's our heritage. And so it just felt like those two things were not congruent. Like you can't say, like say to my neighbor, for example, hey, Mrs. Singh, who's Indian, Mrs. Singh, can you please drop off your kids at our ballet school and become a subscriber, become a donor, join our board. But like, here's a version of your culture on stage that is caricatured and incorrect and based on what Europeans thought they knew about your culture from 150 years ago. And that's too bad. Sorry, because it's art and we can't change it, even though we're about to go on stage tonight and do this show, which has never been done this way before. But sorry, like, let us know when we can expect your check. Like it doesn't work that way. So how do we change this art form into being strictly Eurocentric, to being a global art form, which includes white Americans, right? White Americans are not Europeans. So we're not doing ourselves any favor by just sticking to how Europe saw the world 200 years ago and expect that our performing arts, which are supposed to be living, breathing art experiences, if they don't reflect who we are, then it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel real. So that's really the mission of Final Bow for Yellowface is really figuring out how to shift from a strictly Eurocentric way of doing ballet to something that's global.
So how did you and your co-founder, Georgina, develop what Final Bow eventually became? What was first on your to-do list?
Well, we were just thinking about this idea of activism in general. Like, how do we change the minds of basically like every small town in America has a Nutcracker production. So how do we, get everybody to think about this differently? And we realized that we only actually had to change the minds of maybe even like 10 people. And these 10 people represented the top ballet companies in America, the artistic directors. And if we changed their minds and got people talking about this, we could create a trickle down effect to smaller companies, to dance schools, and to have this be a larger conversation. So we bought yellowface.org. I think it was like $11 at the time. And we put up a simple pledge, which essentially says, I love ballet. And because I want it to be bigger, I'm not going to do Yellowface on our stages. And we felt like using this tone of, instead of going after people, having this
It's being
resource there and saying,
it's expansive, inherently
yeah,
expansive, the vision.
yeah. And we're also practicing inclusive advocacy. We're not saying, hey, you're racist, you need to change. We're saying, hey, we who love ballet, we need to fix this. We need to get together and figure out a solution to this. But we also offered solutions. There's constructive solutions that we offered on the website so that people could think about it and come to this conclusion. So then we started quietly going to ballet companies saying, hey, Peter Martins just changed the Nutcracker. This was, sort of February of 2018. He had just changed it. And I said, I know nobody wants to talk about the Nutcracker in February, but here's the deal. We're all collectively deciding this coming year that we're not going to do Yellowface. Here's a list of companies that have already pledged. Will you like to join us? And if you haven't had that conversation yet, now's the time. You have 9 months, 10 months to get the trusts, whatever choreographic trusts your version comes from, to be approved or approved by the choreographer. You have time to go to your board and say, hey, can we have a little bit of extra budget for new costumes? You can create new rehearsal time. You can find a plan B for what you've usually been doing. But we're telling you now so you can actually take action. And so that first year, we got a lot of small companies, big companies, medium companies to sign on board. Pretty much at this point, since 2017, pretty much every major American ballet company has signed the pledge. A lot of the large European companies are signing this and having this conversation actually right now. The Paris Opera, which is the West's oldest continuous performing arts organization, founded by Louis XIV. They had their first diversity report a couple of years ago, and they cited our work by name as a contributing factor to their decision to no longer do blackface or yellowface on their stages, both on the opera and the ballet. So it's despite the fact that, thank you, despite the fact that we've had this laser focus on the Asian experience, it's had this beautiful ripple effect of saying, how do we see each other better? How do we portray each other with more nuance and more humanity? Because art is supposed to build empathy with people. And so how can we do that across racial lines so that the work has more integrity? So that's really the place where we're at with this work right now.
When you were first approaching companies, what were some of the most common walls that you would hit, if any?
Yeah, the big thing was that I'm sorry, this is tradition, this is heritage. And I think about just the performing arts in general. I mean, we have to treat the performing arts differently than we treat the visual arts or the static arts. So like film, painting, photography, sculpture, those are frozen in time. An artist made that thing, and it really captures the zeitgeist of a moment. So you have to judge the Mona Lisa as a product of its time in the same way you look at a film like, A Birth of a Nation as a cultural product of its time. You can't change it. No one's asking you to do a remake of Birth of a Nation. I don't want to see it on CBS for Christmas, but it is an artifact. Whereas with the performing arts, we have to treat it like a living being, almost like being a gardener. It needs to get a little messy. You need to have pollinators. You need to prune it once in a while to keep its shape because it's this living thing. And if you just look at Shakespeare, I mean, if you've ever seen a Shakespearean play set other than the time Shakespeare wrote it, you're already seeing something radical. If you're seeing a woman on stage, you're already seeing something radical in a Shakespearean play. You know what I mean? So, and if you look at evolution of ballet itself, I mean, tutus have gotten shorter. Sometimes there were no women allowed to do ballet. Sometimes men were not so hot as in ballet. Nowadays you can get your leg all the way up to your ear and it's not considered vulgar, right? We have other things that like maternity leave, cross-training, nutrition, mental health resources, all things that, say, 18th century ballerinas did not have access to. So this art form is changing. We train differently too, right? So if we're changing and our repertoire is changing, then why can't we change, especially if it means being better to get more non-Europeans into this art form, right? Like how many versions of the Nutcracker have you seen? Tell me that change is not possible. How many versions of Balanchine's Apollo have you seen? Right? There's like 4 or 5 versions out there. That's okay. That means that we get more. Don't we want that? Don't we want it to be bigger?
You directed Madame Butterfly
mm-hmm.
in Boston. And in many ways, that's kind of the epitome of European cultural appropriation or exoticization of this quote unquote East. It's such a hot potato. And of course, because of Miss Saigon, it's a hot potato twice over. So can you describe the moment you were asked to direct it? And was that exciting, terrifying? What was your first take on it going to be?
I heard from Brad Vernetter, who's the general director of the Boston Lyric Opera. This was in, I guess, 2020, 2021. Essentially, Boston Lyric Opera had been planning on doing a production of Madame Butterfly that was canceled due to COVID. They were trying to redo it the following season. But then there was this huge surge in this anti-Asian hysteria. And they weren't really sure that they were able to stage this work with integrity. Essentially a tragedy about an Asian woman, when real Asian women outside were being followed home and stabbed and pushed in front of subways and spat on,
right,
et cetera, all the
things
because of COVID.
At, yeah.
Right. So how to do it? And so approached me about hosting a series of conversations called the Butterfly Process, which is still available on BLO's website. And really essentially asking the question, what's wrong with Butterfly, what's good about Butterfly that's worth keeping, and what's a way forward for this work. But we also wanted to not just talk to creatives, singers, directors, historians, scholars, people from all different angles of Madame Butterfly, lots of people who had stakeholders, board members, regular audience members. What's your relationship with this work? And we also centered Asian voices to really focus on the impact of this work when it's done, poorly or without integrity. And that really gave me a roadmap for how to pursue this work, in this shift from going from Eurocentric to global or to multiracial.
So did those conversations kind of convince you in the lyric opera to produce it, or was it set and you decided to have these conversations?
It was the conversation was supposed to inform an upcoming production of Butterfly, and sort of in the midst of the conversation, Brad just asked me, what would you do with this story? Like, what I mean, really, like from a creative standpoint, like how would you save Butterfly? And I'd really been thinking that through, for myself, just to see if it was possible as a thought exercise. But I had no idea that I would even be a person to direct an opera like this. But, I'd always been fascinated but what else could it be, which is my favorite creative prompt. So that really is my sort of guiding North Star in terms of my practice. But what else could it be? So, okay, so what's a geisha? A geisha story. Geisha in Japanese means artist. So what else could it be? An artist. Okay. Could she be a jazz singer? Okay. What does that mean? I was also thinking a lot about Nagasaki. Of course, Puccini's Nagasaki is very different than our Nagasaki, right? We dropped a bomb on it. So that's something that Puccini could have never envisioned, but that is probably the most defining geopolitical event is World War II that still defines our relationship with all of Asia is Japan and World War II. So seeing that moment as a sort of a congruent place to tell a story. I also was exposed to or introduced to Arthur Dong, who his work is incredible. He's an incredible filmmaker, and his film Forbidden City, USA, which is a brilliant short documentary. I highly recommend folks listen to it, or watch it. But it's about these San Francisco Chinatown nightclubs from like the 20s to the 60s that featured sort of Asian Oriental dances, and they sort of had this sort of subversive marketing where they would say, "Oh, come and check out our Oriental blossoms, our beautiful Oriental girls," and you show up, and it's just like the same American dances you'd see at other clubs. They just happen to be Asian Americans, But this subversion of this sort of Orientalness, and so I just began to think, okay, so 1940s. San Francisco Chinatown, and then of course the real defining experience for Japanese Americans was incarceration, and so how to weave all of that into a story. And also, I'm not Japanese American, my family was not incarcerated. If anything, my grandfather hated the Japanese. We're from China, mainland China, so he had his own prejudices and biases. But so to do this story with integrity, I felt like it was something that, even though I'm not Japanese American, as an American, this is our story that we all have to tell. We all have to share the burden of this responsibility of telling the story so that we don't repeat it again. And part of that, too, was collaborating with Japanese Americans to be able to tell that story. So I had a brilliant colleague in Naine Shida Nelson, whose family was incarcerated, and she served as the dramaturg on this production. So working with her as both a Chinese person and a Japanese person, telling this sort of fusion Chinese-Japanese story, American story, was just so rewarding, and it felt like what we accomplished was not excusing Puccini's white gaze, but instead using his music to tell an Asian American story where Asianness was the center. And the response I felt was incredible. What I was most touched by was the response from Asian American people who came up to me and saying, I always cringe at Butterfly, and this was the first time I felt like I could lose myself in the story and just appreciate the music. Michael Sakamoto, who's our choreographer, his father was born in camp, and at the end of the opera, he stood up and said, like, this is true. I saw it. I lived through this. And so just really figuring out a way to tell the story with integrity when we didn't change any of the Puccini, right? Like, we didn't hack it up or do anything crazy with it. It's still, if you close your eyes and listen, it's the same that you'd hear at any other opera house. but it's just done staged in a different way.
How much freedom did you allow yourself to take the libretto apart?
Well, I mean, it's a whole new story.
It's a
So
whole new, it's an entirely new story.
yeah. So I mean, it's a
Oh.
congruent story. So there's
still a love story, I imagine.
well, the love story is not the conventional one, because Pinkerton and Butterfly don't really have a romance like in other operas. I mean, it's even
Right.
arguably like not really a love story in the same way. But I found another love story in this opera, which was the love of a mother and her son. And so the opera starts as you're coming into the theater. Before the opera starts, you see these two Japanese American women, and they're in their kitchen and they're baking a cake. It looks like a birthday cake. And the opera starts, and you see that they're having a birthday party for her son, for Butterfly's son, and who she lost in camp. And so you see the arc of the night she met his father to the moment that she loses her son in camp. And it's still a death. It's not, she didn't literally die, but as any woman who's experienced the loss of a child will tell you that, yes, a part of you dies. So it just felt like the impact at the end wasn't just, oh, well, that's too bad that Asian gal killed her, that Oriental gal killed herself at the end because of honor or whatever. Oh, that's so sweet. Where should we go for dinner, honey? But this one instead says, no, this is a story that all of us can relate to. Has happened to every family. So I just felt like it was keeping the impact of what Puccini wanted, but telling it in a way, again, with more integrity.
So imagine that there is a time when final bow for Yellowface is no longer needed. All its goals have been met. What would that mean? What would that feel like for an Asian or Asian American artist working in the performing arts? How would it be different from them?
It'd be nice to be thought of as a choreographer and not just an Asian choreographer, or an opera director and not an Asian opera director. Yeah, I think we're on our way there, and it's sort of two steps forward, one step back at all times. This really new shift in our urgency of this work really happened after the shooting in Atlanta in 2021. This was March of 2021. It felt like everybody in the ballet world like turned to me and Gina, and they were like, okay, like what's the hashtag? What's the action item? Like, stop Asian hate. What do we post? How do we respond to this? And we're literally like, guys, we're just trying to help you do a not racist nutcracker. Like, what do you mean? What's the action item? Like, what do you want us to do? We're dealing with our own grief, our own, emotional reaction to this. And it's just like, everyone's like, okay, so like now what do we do? And we realized that we weren't in a good place to be this community hub for healing, for processing, for the ballet world. And we realized, oh, we are the Asians in the room. We don't have an Asian community in ballet in the same way that, like, there's other affinity spaces. Dance Theater of Harlem has been a huge hub for Black excellence. There's Ballet Hispanico, Alvin Ely, but like Asian folks, we don't have that. So what do we do? So working with some other leaders in the field, we launched the Gold Standard Arts Foundation. We have our own 501c3. This is like a service organization dedicated to Asian Americans who want to be creatives in dance. So we have professional trainings. We have a membership program. It's $25 a year. It's sort of like NPR. It's like nothing. But it really goes a long way to show that there is a need for this in our community. But yeah, offering, like, we just did a session about grant writing while Asian. So you're talking about your work, you're talking about your identity, and you're Asian. How do you do it? And, no shade to any of the large service organizations, but when we are only 7% of the US population, we can't get all the resources to have the niche conversations that we need to have unless we host them ourselves. So that's what this work is. But it's culminating in these 10,000 Dreams virtual choreographic festivals that are happening all over the country. We just did one at the Northrop in Minneapolis a couple weeks ago, and we're headed to the Kennedy Center in June for a full week. But this came out of during COVID, after the shooting. I went to those ballet directors and I said, okay, you want to support Asian artists? Hire an Asian choreographer. You love putting on the turban for Bayadere. You love putting on the yellow face and the Fu Manchu for Nutcracker. Where are the Asian artists? And can you commit to commissioning an Asian choreographer by 2025? And a lot of the pushback I got was, well, there's no one ready. There's no one who's a good fit for the company. No one's on my radar. And I said, okay, like those are legitimate excuses, but let's get rid of those excuses. So every day during the month of May of 2021, so literally 6 weeks after the shooting in Atlanta, we put together a 31-day Asian Choreographic Festival. Every day during the month of May for Asian Pacific Heritage Month, we highlighted a different choreographer, and you'd go to our website and watch a film from that choreographer. And from that festival, virtual festival, which cost us $0, by the way, we made 5 matches between choreographers and ballet companies. 4 of them were female artists, so we're also helping bridge the gender gap with female choreographers.
That is incredible.
And then now we're able to take that repertoire on the road to be these in-person choreographic festivals. So this year we're honoring what would have been the 75th birthday of Chu Sang-go, a trailblazing Asian American choreographer who was the associate artistic director of the Washington Ballet and made works for everybody. Paris Opera, Alvin Ailey, Boston, Houston, everybody. ABT for Baryshnikov. I mean, he was a star. He unfortunately passed of AIDS in 1987. So we're honoring his legacy by bringing back a lot of his works. Our week at the Kennedy Center includes a gala night with it's Houston Ballet, PNB, Ballet West, Washington Ballet, Singapore Ballet, the National Ballet of China, and Dana Tyson Burgess. So it's this big celebration of Chu Sang-go's work. So we're showcasing new Asian choreographers alongside one of our masters. So ideally, this is a stepping stone to give
And this is all in 3 years. That's incredible.
Yeah. But ideally, like what I'd love to be obsolete when we're just like, oh, it's another Asian person on program B. And it just is. Like, it's a balancing work, an Asian choreographer, and something else. And it's just normal. And we don't think about it. And there's no special slot and there's no special lane that's just for Asian people. It's just like we've got so much talent and so few barriers in our pipeline that we're just organically part of the fabric of the dance community. And that's where I'd like to get. We're on our way. We're not there yet, but we're on our way.
If you'd like to learn more about Phil and read a longer version of this interview in which Phil discusses his and Doug's recent updating of La Bayadere, please head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. If there are artists in your neck of the woods that I might not know of, but that you think would be great subjects for the podcast, please let me know. You can find me on Instagram at PCTalenti. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts, thanks for listening.